Welcome to another edition of the Abrams Boxing Show. I'm Marc Abrams, and we have a big show ahead for you this week. One of the biggest cards of the last 20 years is going to take place on Saturday in Saudi Arabia. That'll be headlined by the rematch for the undisputed light heavyweight championship of the world between Artur Beterbiev and Dmitry Bivol. Also, I'll be joined by boxing producer and longtime boxing producer, man's produced some of the biggest cards on television. Marty Corwin, who's now an author, just wrote an outstanding book on Don King and Bob Arum. He's worked for both of them over the last 30 plus years, and we had a chance to speak with him last week. But let's get right down to it. Last Friday night at the Theater Madison Square Garden, unbeaten lightweight Keyshawn Davis became the WBO lightweight champion of the world with a fourth-round stoppage over Denis Baranchyk. Davis now 13-0 with 9 knockouts. Baranchyk now 19-1. Davis just controlled the fight from the outset. The small Baranchyk never was able to get any type of rhythm because of Keyshawn Davis and what he was doing in there. The fight week was marred by some racial undertones that originally was believed to be from Baranchyk's camp. Still haven't found out who was responsible for that situation that took place in New York, but Keyshawn Davis got the redemption and now is a world champion. And he's calling for big fights. He wants Teofimo Lopez, and he's a guy that he's going to be around a long time. 13-0 now with 9 knockouts and already a world champion. Body shot ended the night for Baranchyk, and just a dominant performance for Keyshawn Davis. Xander Zayas went to 21-0. He scored a ninth-round stoppage over Slava Spomer. Spomer now 20-1. Zayas just dominated the fight, broke Spomer down, and finally the fight was stopped at 2:01 of round number 9. Also, WBO number 10 middleweight Vito Milnicki Jr. and Connor Coyle, the undefeated Connor Coyle, battled to a very spirited and very entertaining 10-round draw. Milnicki now 21-1, 12 knockouts. Coyle 21-0-1 with 9 knockouts. It was, like I said, a good, entertaining fight that I thought Milnicki edged out, but the two judges scored it even 95-95. Milnicki took a card 96-94. Also, unbeaten super lightweight Arnold Barbosa went into enemy territory as he scored a 12-round split decision over Jack Catterall to win the WBO super lightweight championship in Manchester, England. Scores were 115, 113 on 2 cards for Arnold Barbosa Jr., 115, 113 for Mr. Jack Catterall. But Barbosa now is the WBO interim 140-pound champion, and we mentioned Teofimo Lopez a moment ago. Lopez and Barbosa, that seems to be a collision course possibly down the road, as they are both considered WBO champions, as Lopez is the full champion, the interim champion being Barbosa. Mexican super lightweights, Oscar Duarte scored a ninth-round stoppage, a seventh-round stoppage over Miguel Medueno. That place took part at the Pond, I think it's called the Honda Center, where the Ducks play in Anaheim, California. It was an action fight as what was predicted on paper, and Duarte 29-2-1, 23 knockouts, just beat down Medueno, who's now 31-4 with 28 knockouts. As we mentioned at the top of the program, one of the biggest fight cards in recent memory. 7 big world title fights or variations of world title fights will take place in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia as part of Riyadh season. That will be headlined by the rematch for the WBO light heavyweight championship of the world between Artur Beterbiev, who's 21-0 with 20 knockouts. He's going to take on Dmitry Bivol. A rematch, like I said, a highly contested, maybe even controversial fight of a bout that took place in October that Beterbiev edged out the win, and now within 4 months we're going to get the rematch. We don't see this a lot in boxing. We see immediate rematches, but this is a very immediate rematch. I like Beterbiev again. I mean, all these fights, with the exception of the Shakur Stevenson fights, they're all basically 2-1 or less fights. Beterbiev, I think maybe could get a late stoppage in this fight because I think Bivol is going to try to fight more on the inside and really not leave it in the judge's hands himself. So I expect this fight to be more action packed than the first fight. So I like Artur Beterbiev in this one. Joseph Parker, 35 and 3, 23 knockouts, will take on extremely late replacement Martin Bacoli. In fact, Bacoli missed the weigh in. I think he weighed in late on Friday night. Bacoli 21 and 1, 16 knockouts. This will be for the WBO Interim Heavyweight Championship. This was supposed to be for the IBF Championship that Daniel Dubois had to take on Joseph Parker, but Dubois fell ill on Thursday. They quickly, I guess, threw a whole bag of money at Bacoli. Bacoli got on a plane and made it to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. I think he weighed in about 315 pounds on Friday evening. But that fight will take place. That's going to be could be a war. I like Parker just because, I don't know what Bacoli's been doing. We know Parker's been training for a world title fight. Bacoli, he probably was in the gym ready to fight, but he gets the call. This one, championship, Shakur Stevenson, 22-0, 10 knockouts, would take on late replacement Josh Padley, 15-0, 4 knockouts. Padley steps in for Floyd Schofield Jr., who himself felt ill earlier this week, and he was blaming masseuses and Shakur's people, and some kind of whacked out excuse for Adamas we'll talk about the next fight, for Floyd Schofield. I think Padley, who got this fight on the strength of a win over Mark Chamberlain, an undefeated fighter, but Mark Chamberlain ain't Shakur Stevenson. Stevenson gets the stoppage late over the tough Josh Padley, who's taken the fight on about 4 days' notice. As mentioned, Carlos Adames, 24-1, 18 knockouts, defends the WBC middleweight champion when he takes on Hamza Shiraz, 21-0, 17 knockouts. This fight's going to be an action-filled fight. Adames likes to bring it. Shiraz likes to bring it, Shiraz being the taller fighter. I think Hamza Shiraz announces himself really to the middleweight division on Saturday, I think he gets a stoppage over Adames in an action-packed war. And speaking of wars, Virgil Ortiz, 22-0, 21 knockouts, defends his WBC interim super welterweight championship against Israel Madrimov. Madrimov 10-1, the one being the loss to Terrence Crawford late last year with 7 knockouts. I'm going to go slight edge to Madrimov. I think Madrimov has a couple more tools in his tool belt. Got the fight against Crawford, although a loss, a tremendous learning experience. I think Madrimov gets the win on Saturday. Zhali Zhang, 27-2-1, 22 knockouts, takes on Agit Kabiel, 25-0, 17 knockouts for the WBC interim heavyweight championship. Going to be another fight's be a war. Two punchers who bring it. I'm going to take Kabiel in this one as well. I like him. He's based on the last couple fights he's won. I've actually bet on him the last 2 fights. He's got me the money both times. Expect another good performance. Zhali Zhang, 41 years old, punches as hard as anyone. But I like Kabiel in this one. And kicking off the festivities at 10:30 a.m. Saturday morning in a fight that could be a main event on any DAZN, ESPN, whatever type of card. And it would be a main event pay-per-view fight. 13 knockouts, defends the WBO light heavyweight championship. He takes on Callum Smith, 30-2, 22 knockouts. I'm going to take Buatsi in this fight. Buatsi, I think, a little bit more athletic. Hasn't looked great in some recent fights, but I like him to defeat Callum Smith. Earlier this week, I had a chance to speak with boxing producer Marty Corwin. He's a guy who produces a lot of the fights for Top Rank, and he's done a lot for Don King over the past 30 years. He just wrote a book on the 2 legendary promoters. Now joining me on the line is a longtime guy, been doing this a very long time. He's been at the helm behind the camera for some of the biggest fights of the last 5-6 decades. Marty Corwin just out with a brand new book, an exciting read. I can't wait to get my hands on, called Aram and King: 6 Decades of Boxing Gold, which chronicles A lot of war stories, traveling the roads with the two biggest promoters of all time, Bob Arum and Don King. Marty, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. It's great to be with you after all these years. We've worked together a couple times in the over the decades, but great to be here. Thanks for asking me.
My pleasure. And obviously, I work with promoters, and obviously, the two of the, I mean, not two of the two biggest ones and the biggest fights of all time have been with Bob Arum and Don King. And like I said, you've been pulling the strings behind the camera for a lot of these major, the biggest fights ever. So, well, first of all, what gave you the impetus to write this book?
It really started that I was just trying to get down some of the stories of things that have happened to me in the last 40 plus years in broadcasting. Before I forgot them, I wanted to get some of the stories down, and I thought I'd share them with friends. I have a good buddy who named Dominic Biondi in Las Vegas, who was actually an English professor at a university. And he was reading this. He says, "You should get this published." I said, "Come on, get out of here. What do you mean get it? Who would want to read it?" He says, "No, trust me. People will want to read this."
And I agree. I mean, I haven't done it quite as long as you. I've only been doing this 24 years, and
So
I
I
haven't probably been,
contacted and said, we've
I
done
have,
boxing books before. Sorry.
yeah. Now you go.
We've done boxing books before, but this one's different. We like this because it's not just a boxing book. It comes from the perspective of a TV producer, and that's different. And as far as why Bob Arum and Don King, I'm the only human being who's been a department head for both of them.
Well, like I said, I haven't been doing it as long as you. I've only been doing 24, but I haven't done nearly the traveling that you do. But like I said, being on the road and just seeing what you see, I would imagine some of these stories started in bars, maybe some of them finished in bars, because that's where a lot of these great conversations and stories usually start and maybe sometimes end at.
There have been a few adult beverages involved, but I was talking to somebody very recently about some of these stories, and they said, I wonder if that would happen now. And frankly, I don't think so, because a lot of these stories going back 30 years, if I didn't put it in a book, people would never have known about it. But now, if you argue with somebody about a parking space, there's a million views online.
Yeah.
You really kind of watch yourself now, what you do, even in public, when you don't think anyone's watching.
I would imagine Don King and Bob Arum, as different as they are, one guy who was from the streets of Cleveland, and another guy, a Harvard law graduate, lawyer, worked in the U.S. Attorney's Office. I bet you there's a lot more similarities than we would think on the surface of these two men.
And that's a part of the book that, in a chapter about what is it to be a promoter, and I talk about these two guys coming from completely different backgrounds. Bob Arum, as a cum laude Harvard lawyer, could have easily kept with that the entire career and decided to get into boxing after an introduction to Lester Mallets in 1962 or three. And Don King, who, when he came out of prison after a manslaughter charge, turned his life around and got into boxing as an amazing street hustler and one of the smartest people I've ever met. Came from completely different backgrounds, but both rose to the pinnacle of this sport and became very similar in their abilities to do what very few people can do.
What do you think would, if I asked you, and this may be a tough answer or maybe to put together in a few sentences, if I had to say what would be one common denominator between the two, what would come to mind for you?
People, when they see a Bob Arum or a Don King at a press conference or in the ring after a fight, they think that's what being a promoter is about. They think that little bit of celebrity, being on camera in those instances, but that is a minuscule portion, as you know, that's a minuscule portion of being a promoter. These guys both work around the clock and have for decades, literally working long days, combining the skills of a lawyer, a street hustler, a child psychologist, and all the things you need to have in your tool bag to be a promoter, that they both have very similar abilities. Don King, when I worked for him, took no days off, no holidays, no vacations, worked around the clock. It amazed me, the work ethic of him. And Bob Arum, same thing. He's in the office at 92. He's in the office every day. And he comes to every fight. You see him at the ring in the first fight of the event. And these guys both have an inhuman work ethic.
And the amazing thing about Aram, I mean, and especially in the past couple of years, he mentioned as he got into his 90s, it's New York one weekend, England the next weekend, Saudi Arabia the weekend after that, Australia, Japan, no matter where it is, he's getting on that plane and he's going to be ringside and like you said after the fight's usually in the ring, no matter where the fights are, still to this day.
And we really worry about him because he has a schedule that would crush a 30-year-old, and he's 92. It is amazing.
Talk about some of the events that you've produced over the years. What maybe one or two from each promoter comes to mind?
When I started in boxing in 1993, my play-by-play announcer, who became my best friend for decades, Colonel Bob Sheridan, he said to me, Marty, I can't believe he's from Boston. He used to call me Marty, which I had to learn was Marty from. He says, you're starting right at the top, Marty. It's like if you were a baseball director and you start in the World Series. Because I was doing right off the bat with Don King, Julio Cesar Chavez fights, Tyson fights. It was a few weeks into my job with Don, I wound up meeting Mike Tyson and getting ready for his exit from prison and his fights with McNeely and others. So I started with Don King right away with those events. My second or third event, I'm not sure which, was in Quito, Ecuador. It was Bernard Hopkins against Segundo Mercado, which I produced and directed and fed to Showtime because they didn't go to Ecuador. So talk about trial by fire right off the bat with Don. And of course, in addition to Julio Cesar Chavez and Mike Tyson, I got to meet Larry Holmes and Don had a lot of other great fighters, Terry Norris and Felix Trinidad, one of my favorite fighters of all time. I love doing the Puerto Rico shows with Felix Trinidad. With Bob Arum, my first fight with Bob Arum was Oscar De La Hoya against Ike Corte, February 13th of 1999. And right off the bat, starting with Oscar De La Hoya and then going to the Morales Barrera trilogy, which I did for him, and all the fights with Miguel Cotto, and I did a bunch of the Floyd Mayweather fights. But then my favorite boxer, probably of my entire boxing career, Manny Pacquiao, and all the Manny Pacquiao fights. I loved working with Manny because his accomplishments of being a champion in 8 weight classes. If you ask a fighter, that's the most impressive thing going. Plus, a great human being. I always had tremendous respect for Manny. So those are some of the fighters that really caught my attention, and I really feel very fortunate to have worked with all these great fighters.
Do you have a favorite fight that stands out? If I could say, hey, what's that one fight where is that pinch myself moment? Do you want of those?
Different fights really stick in your memory for different reasons. I've been in 3 riots in my boxing career. The most memorable of those was when Axel Schultz fought Francois Botha in East Germany. There was a big riot after that fight because Francois Botha won the first 7 rounds. But Axel Schultz really won the last few rounds. So the German crowd thought for sure he won the fight, but he lost by split decision. So they went crazy. And we were in the middle of a riot in that fight. And that's pretty memorable. Of course, the ear bite fight, Tyson Holyfield too, that was a little memorable, and another riot. But some of the fights that were just amazing performances, like the Eric Morales Barrera fights, the Juan Manuel Marquez and Manny Pacquiao, amazing fight. Floyd Mayweather and Hatton. These are some fights that really stick in your memory.
What today producing fights in 2025, like you said, you've been doing this, for 5, 6 decades now. What in terms of maybe the technological aspect has changed the most in your opinion?
it's been absolutely night and day. Everything has changed completely in the 40 plus years because before boxing, I did 110 games a year for Viacom. I produced and directed Bullets basketball on the road, Caps hockey on the road, Orioles baseball. So from those sports in the early 80s, I was doing that up until when I started in boxing. And I started with Showtime and did Showtime fights for years, and then 17 years with HBO, and now 8 years with ESPN. The technology has completely changed from these gigantic cameras that weighed a ton to these much smaller cameras that can now shoot 4K. I was doing boxing through the change to digital. I went from analog video to digital video. Unbelievable change. From digital video to high def, amazing change. And now the other devices, the graphics devices, the AI, and everything that they're doing now, remarkable. But the biggest change was from broadcast television now to direct to consumer streaming television. I watched HBO get out of the business. I watched Showtime get out of the business. And those changes were just nobody expected.
I mean, and like I said, even like the stuff that we're talking about, like the streaming, it's somewhat new, but where do you see broadcast boxing in terms of what you do? I mean, where do you see the like the next, I guess, evolution of it? Where do you see that going?
Well, it's good for fans. It's good for fight fans. It's good for consumers because, I always think it's funny when somebody talks about boxing dying. There's more boxing on television now than there's ever been in history. Every day, every network, you can watch fights that are kind of club level fights now, which nobody used to be able to do before because streaming has made it more affordable and it's direct to consumer. So you can put the product right out there to people without having to, have the expense of all the satellite production and everything else. So I think it just gets better and better. All of these events going to consumers, a lot more choices. It's just good for consumers.
You mentioned earlier before going to Quito, Ecuador, for the Hopkins Condo fight. You've been all over the world. I mean, I can only imagine how much air miles you have and how many times that passport's been stamped. You have a favorite place or two, maybe outside the United States, that you like shooting boxing?
I've been to 40 countries. I've at least shot boxing in 20 or more. I had, a great event in the south of Ireland in Cork. Was a wonderful broadcast with Steve O'Collins against Eubanks. That was a great, entertaining fight. I love doing fights all over the UK. We did lots of fights in London and Newcastle and Ireland, Dublin. But Mexico, for me, was the start because when I started with Don King and was doing all the Julio Cesar Chavez fights, we were all over Mexico. And I fell in love with, working in Mexico and the people I met. So that was kind of a favorite. But the Philippines is wonderful, and we did fights in Kuala Lumpur. It's hard to pick one place. I also did a lot of production in Argentina. I did a World Cup in Argentina in the early 2000s. So, you know,
Well,
lots of great places.
you mentioned Mexico, so and Don King obviously. So I would imagine you did that fight with Haugen with the Stadio Azteca, 130 something thousand people there.
The largest paid attendance ever, 132,000 people paid attendance, over 150,000 people were there. Still to this day, the largest paid attendance. There were people in the back with like picnic setups and barbecuing in the stands watching the fight. I tell that story too. Jimmy Lennon had some great stories from that event. Yes, that was an amazing event.
Yeah, I mean, and those are, I mean, those I distinctly remember that show. And those are your shots, the great overhead shots of the stadium looking in and seeing that mass of humanity in there.
It was, and the president of Mexico came in a helicopter.
So-
But some of my favorites, actually, I just remembered one other thing worth mentioning. Some of my absolute favorite fights were done in London, along with Frank Warren. When Don King worked with Frank Warren, all of the Nigel Benn fights and Lennox Lewis fights and Prince Nassim fights, really entertaining fights. Especially Prince Nassim was some of his ring walks were really memorable. Those were great events.
So I assume you did Nigel Benn, Chris Eubank fight way back when.
I didn't do that. That was before my time, but I did do the Oliver McCall Frank Bruno fight at Wembley, and that was an amazing fight. A really funny, very quick story from that event. When we were setting up for it, there was a meeting that was being chaired by the head of Sky back then. A guy by the name of Mike Allen was the director, and we had a site survey, it's called. And everybody showed up because there was so much interest in that fight because the winner was going to fight Tyson. So everybody was there. The Germans showed up, the French showed up, the Japanese showed up. And at one point, discussing the setup for the event, the German broadcaster, Premier, a guy said, well, by the way, since we are outside, you're going to have the aerial shots. Maybe you have the helicopter. And Mike Allen said, no, I think our helicopter's in the shop just then because they didn't have one. And he says, well, we have this device that's lighter than air that can hold a camera we can shoot. Because remember, this is a long time before drones,
Yeah.
that we can shoot from the air to get a shot. And the English director said, I think we've had enough of your airships over here.
Yeah. It's like it's stories like that. Like I said, I've worked, behind the scenes. It's the behind the scenes. You have a lot of the behind the scenes stuff in the book. Stuff that what most people see is two guys walk in the ring, they punch each other for 12 rounds. That's it. You good night. But there's so much that goes into putting on an event, especially on television. And I assume there's gonna be a lot of that in the book. There's I guess you want to call them, for lack of better terms, cute little stories.
I hope some of those stories are interesting for people because it's not just for boxing purists. There's other stories that might interest people that aren't. There's also some history in the book. I talk about the origins of boxing. The first time the term boxing was used in 1719 when James Figg became the first boxing champion. The 1867 Marquess Queensberry rules. I talk about some of the history of boxing. So even somebody who's just kind of a novice boxing viewer might be interested.
And we'll end it with this, and it's a good synergy here. You're talking to us from New York. You're going to be producing the show this Friday night between Dennis Baranchek and Keyshawn Davis at the Theater Madison Square Garden. So I'd be remiss Madison Square Garden memories. What do you have for that?
I've been working in Madison Square Garden since 1982 when I did the first basketball game I did there. It's a tough building, but it's got so much history. You really admire that building. And I've done so many events in Madison Square Garden. However, it's a tough building to work in. My favorite joke about Madison Square Garden, and I've told this to the people I know for years there, that my favorite part of the movie Godzilla is when they blow that place up.
Yeah. Well, what about any fights stick out? Any fights stick out to you that you shot of the thousands of fight nights that you've been there for?
Some amazing fights, especially around Puerto Rican Day. We've done fights with Miguel Cotto and now Xander Zayas. Some of the Puerto Rican Day weekend fights, just amazing in that building. So yeah, there's a lot that have stuck out. And this weekend's fight on ESPN, the main event, but the co-main event with Xander Zayas, one of my favorite young stars from Puerto Rico. He's got a tough bout. Two undefeated guys going at it. This is going to be a really good show. Plus, there's so many other great guys on this card. You've got Jared Anderson is going to be fighting, and you've got Tiger Johnson. There's a lot of great talent on this one card at the theater at Madison Square Garden this weekend. Yep.
There you have it, Marty Corwin. Thank you for a few minutes of your time. The book is called Arum and King: 6 Decades of Boxing Gold. Where can you get it?
You can get it on Amazon, or you can get it directly from the publisher, Roman and Littlefield.
There you have it. It's a great book. I can't wait to get my hands on. Something tells me this is going to be one of these books where maybe 2, 3 hours I may go right through it. I mean, it seems like one of those books that I'm not going to be able to put down. Thank you, Marty. We'll talk to you
I
along
hope
the
so.
way.
The guys that I wrote about. Thank you very much.
Finish what you were saying. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say that the guys I wrote about, Bob Arum and Don King, they deserve accolades for their accomplishments. And that was my greatest goal in the book.
The two greatest ever do. Thank you, Marty, for a few minutes at a time. We'll talk to you along the way.